Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to bring aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply together and look at something called short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So we've dealt with equilibrium several times throughout the course, and we introduced it way back in Unit 2 when we looked at a market for a single good or service. Well, just like with market equilibrium, macroequilibrium is when supply and demand comes together, except we're looking at aggregate supply and demand as opposed to just market supply and demand. So the definition of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is equilibrium in which short-run aggregate supply intersects aggregate demand. And that's really important here because you notice here we're looking at short-run aggregate supply. We're going to bring in long-run in the next video. But anywhere that short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, that will be a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And I think the best way to see it is, of course, to draw it. And that's what we're going to do here. The labels have not changed. The labels have not changed once in this unit. It's still going to be Y for real GDP and PL for price level. Aggregate demand is always going to be downward sloping, so just like that. And then we're going to just use short-run aggregate supply, which of course we know, thanks to the sticky wage theory, is going to be upward sloping. So we have S, R, A, S, just like that. And so where those two curves intersect, that will be our short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And so we'll bring that down, and then we'll call this Y1 for our current GDP, real GDP, and then our price level, we will call that PL1. So that is short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, right? It's where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. Pretty simple. But of course, we know that we can change short-run macroeconomic equilibrium by changing either aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply, or yes, we could even shift both curves as a double shift. But to understand this, I want to introduce several vocabulary terms. So what I recommend is I'm going to show them all to you at once, and I would write them all down and then re-watch this as I explain them, because it can be hard to write and listen at the same time. So here they are. So positive demand, anytime that we have a curve shift in aggregate supply and demand, that model, it's called a shock, because it is a shock to the system. It's a change. That's what we mean by shock. So anytime we say the word shock, we mean a change to either aggregate demand, if it's a demand shock, or a change to aggregate supply, most likely short-run aggregate supply if it is a supply shock. A positive shock increases the corresponding curve. A negative shock would decrease the corresponding curve. So if it's a positive demand shock, that's an increase in AD. A negative demand shock would decrease AD. Same thing with positive and negative supply shocks. The one thing I will point out here is that a negative supply shock is called stagflation. The reason for this, you see kind of two words here. You see the word stagnant, which means an economy that isn't really producing anything. And we see the word flation or inflation, which means a higher price level. And what you notice is that if you move short-run aggregate supply to the left, you get inflation and you get a stagnant economy in terms of less real GDP and higher unemployment. So just remember that a negative supply shock is called stagflation. You will see that term come up frequently on the AP exam. Of course, depending upon how we shift the curves, we can get inflation. If we shift aggregate demand to the right, which we're going to look at an example of that in just a second, we will get something called demand pull inflation. This is inflation caused by a positive demand shock or an increase in aggregate demand. Demand is pulling inflation up. Okay, demand pull inflation. Um, the other one is called cost pull, or sometimes it's called cost push inflation. And cost push inflation or cost pull inflation is inflation caused by a negative supply shock. So if we shift short run aggregate supply to the left, you would get inflation as well in terms of a higher price level. So just some vocabulary here that's important to know as we think about shifting a curve or curves in the short run ADAS model. So let's do an example of just that. So we have our graph again of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And what we're going to say here is that there is an increase in consumer spending, maybe as the result of some stimulus checks. So we have more consumer spending, and we know that's going to move aggregate demand because aggregate demand is composed of the components of real GDP: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So because there's more government spending, that's going to move aggregate demand to the right. So we just draw our new aggregate demand curve. What you've learned in Unit 2 comes back here to help you. Of course, we need to remember our arrow indicating the direction of the curve shift. So this is a positive demand shock because aggregate demand has increased or moved to the right. We have a new equilibrium right here. And so then we'll come down for our new GDP, real GDP level. So that's going to be Y2. And we have a new price level, which is going to be PL2. And so, yes, it's important to know how to move the curve, but I also want you to understand what is happening to those key macroeconomic indicators we looked at in the last unit. So one thing you might do when you do one of these problems is say, okay, what happened to real GDP? Well, we can see that increased, right? That's one of the variables on the graph. What about inflation? Well, we see that there's a higher price level, so we know that the price level increased, which means there is inflation. Remember, the price level could be CPI, it could be GDP deflator, wherever we are on the floor of the building. And then finally, I think the hardest one probably is unemployment because it's not directly on the graph. But the key here is to remember the relationship between GDP and unemployment. If we have higher GDP, that means we're producing more stuff. That means more workers are needed to make this stuff, right? We need more people coming in as a resource. And because of that, more people are working, which means less unemployment. So if you remember that real GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship, that will be helpful. If you remember that price level and unemployment in the short run have a inverse relationship, that will help you. And in the short run, if you remember that real GDP and price level have a direct relationship, that will also help you. So it's important to understand the relationships between variables in AP macroeconomics. It's very, very helpful to understand how all these variables work together to explain what's going on in the macroeconomy. So I would encourage you to do as many examples, as many practice problems as you can, modeling this stuff. You might even try a double shift and say, okay, I'm going to move AD to the right, and then I'm going to move SRAS to the left and see what happens. Just like with, the one thing I'll say about double shifts before we go is just like with market supply and demand, one curve will be indeterminate, or one variable will be indeterminate. So in other words, either price level or real GDP, and then the other one will change. So it works just like it would with a double shift in market supply and demand. So that's all for this video on short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Until next time, have a great day.